Let's talk to Peter Hitchens. Peter, very good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My question to Andrew Bridgen this morning was, has Boris Johnson, by admitting that he knows everybody hates him now, actually done some repair to his reputation? I'm assuming that you will say no.
Well, no, there's supposed to be a sort of penitent strategy which politicians go through when they're in trouble, where they act as if they're really sad about how terrible they are for a bit. Blair used to do this on the advice of his mental valet, Alistair Campbell. From time to time, he'd appear and say woefully, yes, we made mistakes, we fouled up. And it worked for him, so it may work for Mr. Johnson. And the problem remains for those of us who don't think much of him as Prime Minister, that there is no coherent parliamentary opposition. And there isn't any coherent opposition to him in the Conservative Party either, as we learned last week when Sir Graham Brady and his regiments all caved in. So it's a bit difficult to know what to do, even though he is useless. There isn't anybody less useless available at the moment.
That's very true. I enjoyed your piece, actually, about how we kind of lost control of the political system in this country, and has been for many years and many administrations not really representative of the people at all.
Well, they used to think that it used to happen, although the two political parties had many faults, and no one's saying they were perfect. The great thing was that they more or less represented the old divide in the country, which existed, I suppose, up until the mid-60s, which is basically a class divide. But since then, they don't represent the divide in the country, which is now something completely different. I'd sum it up in shorthand as the difference between Polly Toynbee of The Guardian and me. Mm. It's all about social and moral issues and education and marriage and sex and things of that kind, not about nationalisation and trade unions anymore. And the two political parties are basically very much on the Polly Toynbee side. And they don't really have anything to fight each other against. So they have these phony wrestling matches every few years in which they pretend to be opposed to each other and in which huge amounts of money are spent on public relations tricks of various kinds, and one party or the other wins. I don't know whether you've ever read a fantastic book by Kingsley Amis called Girl 20. He's kind of been eclipsed by his son Martin in recent years, but Girl 20 is very funny in many ways. It contains, amongst other things, the most brilliant account of a phony wrestling match that you have ever read in your life.
I've not actually read the book. I do like Martin Amis, but I've not really...
Well, this is much better than anything Martin Amis has ever written. But the thing is, until it's over, you aren't sure whether it was phony or not. The staging of it is so clever, but it's very, very funny, and it's very similar in some ways to British politics. A phony wrestling match in which everybody screams and groans and thumps and howls. Yeah. But actually, they're all pals.
Yes. Well, I found it amusing when the Liberal Democrats sort of finally hit the buffers very, very, very slowly. And when they had their leadership contest, Ed Davey emerged triumphant. Didn't seem really worth winning. When he then declared, I'm going to go around the country to decide what it is, or to help me decide what it is I should be standing for, because I don't know what I stand for. But if you tell me what you think I should stand for, I'll be more than happy to represent you.
Yeah, I was amazed that the Liberal Democrats didn't parachute out of the coalition with David Cameron when they had the chance. That was the moment at which they might have saved themselves as a party. But as soon as they went into the election, still as part of that coalition, they were doomed because they had simply been destroyed by it. I don't think they'll ever recover, and it leaves a very interesting hole in British politics for a dissenting third party, which nobody has tried to fill yet. Perhaps somebody will from a different direction. That might be some sign of hope, but at the moment I see, as you know, none at all.
No, indeed. I mean, Lawrence Fox was on with Julia Hartley-Brewer earlier on. He's trying to form a new party. I've spoken to David Curtin, who's a sort of Christian assembly member of the London Assembly. He's forming something called the Heritage Party, which is meant to be kind of traditional conservatism. I mean, you've still got Nigel Farage in the background. But as you've said before, Peter, it's very difficult for a third party to kind of break into the monopoly, isn't it?
Well, one of the big two parties has to die. Otherwise, you can set up a thing and call it a party, but it bears the same relation as a Hornby 00 train set does to the London North Eastern Railway, as used to be. It's a toy until you can actually get large numbers of seats in Parliament, which only happened when the Liberal parties, we know, died in the 1920s. The Tory Party nearly died, should have died in 2010. But was madly saved by the electorate, who decided to rescue it from its deserved doom, and also, what's more, to endorse David Cameron's Blairisation of it. So the Tory party had become, under David Cameron, a Blairite party, and Tory voters rushed to vote to approve this. And so they saved it. If that hadn't happened, the Tory party would, in my view, have collapsed, been unable to raise funds or continue, and there would then have been a hole which could have been filled. How it would have been filled, no one can say, but there would certainly have been an opportunity to construct a new party which actually stood for the more conservative-minded, patriotic people in this country who at the moment are entirely unrepresented.
Yes, it does seem so. I mean, there are still a few people out there who kind of steadfastly back Boris because he is the Prime Minister, because he is the only hope that they really have, and that those of us who are being critical of them are being somehow disloyal. I don't consider myself to be a Tory. I don't even know what the Tories stand for anymore. I presume you probably don't consider yourself to be a Tory either.
No, I had a brief brush with them some years ago, but what I discovered were two things. First of all, there was no politics at all in the Tory party. And secondly, members of the Tory party have less influence over the Tory party than non-members. I think there is absolutely no mechanism in that party for members or supporters to have any impact at all on policy, which is decided entirely elsewhere by a completely impregnable clique. I even once tried to get hold of a copy of the Constitution. I can't tell you how difficult it was. In many cases, they actually tried to charge people more than £100 for copies of it. You can't even discover how it's run. It's an extraordinary body, but it has always been a machine for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen. It has no fundamental political beliefs at all. And I'll say it again. The Tory party would guillotine the Queen in Trafalgar Square if it thought it would keep it in office.
Yes, I think that's probably true, and I think many of us have seen that. I mean, I don't know what you made of the stories about Boris Johnson over the weekend. Tom Bowers' book, obviously fascinating in its way. Boris Johnson's own interviewing technique, where he's sort of attempting to get back that, that sort of friendly Boris that we all used to quite like, albeit that, you probably thought he was always a bit of a buffoon. But, the whole idea of this triple lockdown, which they're now talking about, because we might not be behaving ourselves, is absolute anathema to most people.
Well, it's collective punishment, and also for something we haven't done. The idea that the normal behavior of normal human beings is itself some sort of sin or crime is a ludicrous fantasy which only the weird utopian totalitarians could entertain. The secret of good government is basically to let men alone. And once you start interfering in the tiny detail of people's lives, when they can go out to eat, who they can see, whether they can even visit their own relatives, you're doomed in terms of any kind of proper free politics. You're inevitably, you have to reach for the levers of totalitarianism and to start punishing the people. I was reminded of Bertolt Brecht, the German communist playwright, who, after the workers rose against a workers' state in 1953, joked that the government would have to elect a new people since the people had failed the government.
Yes, indeed.
It's the situation that we're in.
You've mentioned that before, yeah. I mean,
Sorry,
it seems
no.
I mean, it's worth mentioning again, but it seems as well that we're living in this kind of Alice in Wonderland kind of bubble, whereby I'm reading this morning on the front page of the Daily Mail the fiasco over the COVID count, whereby the test and trace system doesn't work. Even if the tests are right, which they may not be, they can't trace anyone because they forget to do it or because they can't get in touch with them. I mean, the whole thing just seems to be completely shambolic now.
Testing has always been a bizarre fetish. And the idea that you could ever conceivably develop a bureaucracy and a surveillance system efficient enough to track down every contact and to isolate every person who was producing the infection was absurd in the first place. The second idea that COVID itself was a disease so dangerous that this would be justified has, I think, now been shown comprehensively to be untrue. And COVID is very dangerous to some people, but not very dangerous to most. And the other thing is, how can you, in a population of roughly 70 million, what conceivable system could ever discover how many people in this country have a disease which in many cases has no symptoms? You can't do it. It's what all these test and trace figures are figures of how many people have been tested and traced. They tell you absolutely nothing else of any importance. A much more significant figure of that of hospital admissions, which I'm tracking every day. They are rising. There's no question of that. This is time of year when people do tend to get ill with respiratory illnesses. But two claims have been made. One by a BBC journalist who said that the hospital admissions were doubling roughly every fortnight. And the other by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who said on the 18th of September that they were doubling every 7 to 8 days. If you go to the Peter Hitchens blog, you'll see my own tracking of this shows that whatever is happening to hospital admissions, those claims are not borne out by the facts. And this is very similar, of course, to the Witty Valance ludicrous claims, which we discussed after they'd made them a couple of weeks ago. Nonsensical. They're simply not borne out by anything that's happening. And the whole attempt, which I think was probably designed to get the Coronavirus Act renewed in Parliament on September the 30th, the whole attempt to get us to believe that a huge and devastating second wave was on the way, is faltering because the facts simply don't back it up. But how much of this is covered, for instance, on the BBC? Not really very much.
Well, no, I mean, I saw Carl Hennigan wrote a piece in The Spectator over the course of the weekend as well, in which he was talking about following the evidence for hospital admissions, and he pointed out that actually many of these hospital admissions are not for COVID at all. And we're not really, and people seem to be very kind of laissez-faire in the journalistic world about what they believe when they're told it. You know, I mean, you and I think, grew up in the journalistic view that don't believe anything anybody tells you because it's almost certainly to be there's something wrong with it. Whereas now, everybody just takes whatever any government minister says and goes with it.
It is extraordinary, the level of acceptance of official statements. And it is one of the things which you learn in practice. I mean, obviously, when you set out, you're as credulous as anybody else. But after a while, you discover, particularly if you have, for instance, seen a trial in progress, you discover that people simply don't always tell the truth.
Right. Even
when they do, they often don't tell the whole truth. And this is not just criminal defendants we're talking about, it's the authorities. And the great motto, which I think we discussed at the beginning of this, Otto von Bismarck's "never believe anything until it's been officially denied," has been mine for many years. And I think I'm astonished at the credulity of so many of my colleagues. It continues to be the case that the public are just not being very well. So newspapers are beginning to shift a bit.
Yeah.
Several are doing a lot better than they were, and thank heaven for that. But it's still, particularly in broad, people who listen only to the BBC are still astonished. So, for instance, when somebody said, I was on a BBC programme yesterday, it's happening a bit more than it did for the past 6 months. Good. And you were quite, but I'd had a great famine. But somebody else on the panel said that she wore a mask to protect others. Said, in your opinion. And she was quite, I think, surprised by that. But so were listeners. What do you mean? They didn't even know that there is any dispute in science about whether masks are effective. They simply are unaware of it because the BBC doesn't cover the controversy. And Matthew Parris in the Times wrote a very good piece on this on Saturday, which I commend to everybody, because Matthew Parris is, of course, pretty much a BBC liberal himself. He pointed out that even when he was campaigning for homosexual equality, when it was a very minority cause, the BBC gave him and his allies a fair crack. And he also recalled during the Falklands War, when Tam Dalyell was criticising the war, even though the overwhelming majority of the population were in favour of the task force, the BBC covered what Tam Dalyell was saying, quite rightly, because where there is dissent, it should be covered. That dissent may be right, as it turned out, of course, to be the case most spectacularly in the Iraq War. Dissent has to be covered, but increasingly it's not.
It really isn't. But also, because of this news cycle that we currently seem to be living through, something that's said by Matt Hancock yesterday is sort of immediately forgotten tomorrow. So nobody really goes back and says, well, hang on, the other day you said this. And looking at the Andrew Neil tweet at the weekend as well of the UK daily cases, you know, we've got on the one hand the projection by Messrs Whitty and Valance, which has come nowhere near the actual truth of the number of cases. I mean, they've admitted more or less that they made all that up to scare people. We are being told now that this is all about the collection of data. But so we're running government policy now on modelling, pure and simple.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that you could, if you wanted to, produce economic statistics, and indeed statistics about people failed by what has become effectively the National COVID Service instead of the National Health Service, and you could project them out into the future, I think, much more realistically than these are being projected. Yeah. And show terrible things to go. Hey, look, just for instance, today the closure of a whole chain of cinemas.
Yeah, 128 of them.
Catastrophic. Will they open again? I have to say,
I doubt it.
Doubt it. The whole habit of cinema going has been destroyed, and people say it's been destroyed by COVID. Here's another thing the BBC does. It says life has been changed by COVID. It hasn't been changed by COVID. It's been changed by the government's response to COVID, which was a matter of choice, which they didn't need to take. And yet again, the assumption all the time, nothing else could ever have been done. There was no alternative option. And when people used to say in the Thatcherite age, there is no alternative, I would always reply, whenever anybody tells you there is no alternative, what they mean is there is an alternative.
Yeah.
They don't want you to think about it.
No, quite. And that alternative, I wonder, and let me ask you this final question, as I always do each week. At what point does the British public just say enough is enough? We've had enough. I think if they try and do another proper lockdown, people will actually revolt against that somehow.
Well, I was in Soho on Saturday night, and the streets were boiling with people. And it seemed to me that what was happening was that people in practice, in the running of their lives, and as far as they can do it, have already started not to believe what they're told. But the problem and they will increasingly just ignore it. Mm. The problem with that is that unless you combine that with a political and scientific skepticism about the policies of the government, all that happens is increasing numbers of people get fined, get confined to their homes, that the government rages that we're not behaving properly and demands that the people are replaced by more compliant people, locks us in our homes, cancels Christmas, or whatever else it plans to do. And until the actual issue of whether what the government did in March was right is properly aired, politically and journalistically, we're stuck. However rebellious people may become when they want to go out for a drink or a meal or simply want to go out, it won't solve the matter. It will just make the government more furious. And so although there will be practical but non-political revolt, what we need is a political opposition which dismantles this thing and gets us back to something like normal life.
Okay. Peter Hitchens, thank you very much indeed. We'll talk to you next week. Peter Hitchens, columnist for the Mail on Sunday, of course. Very, very interesting words. Winter is coming is what Neil Oliver told us on Wednesday of last week. And of course, the government will tell you that bad things are coming if we don't behave. It's a very dangerous place to be, isn't it?